right now, very happy to have on the show Hafsa Kanjwal, an associate professor in South Asian history at Lafayette College. And her work focuses on Kashmir. And it's something to do with Kashmir and not the clothing, the place, the land. And I'll explain it all. Hafsa, how are you? Welcome to the show.
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
So thanks for being on. This was an issue. I was at the ISNA convention over the weekend, and this came up a lot there. A lot of people were talking about it. In fact, Bernie Sanders and Julian Castro both spoke and touched on it because I'm sure their staffers were told this was an issue that deserved more press coverage. It didn't get much. And I wanted you on, because you're a professor, to first give us a little bit of a history of Kashmir, because everyone's heard of the dispute. They might know Pakistan and India have been at odds about it for years. But something happened just last month where India flooded Kashmir with troops, cut off communications, and from what I'm seeing from reports that people are suffering there. But before we get to that, tell us, first explain, where is Kashmir? Let's do this very simply. Like, where is Kashmir located?
Sure. So Kashmir is a Himalayan region between India and Pakistan. It actually borders both countries. It has about 12 million people. It's split up into 3 different regions, and this is the part of Kashmir that is part of India, Jammu, Ladakh, and the Kashmir Valley. And the Kashmir Valley is kind of where most of the hub of the resistance to Indian rule is. And Pakistan actually also has a part of Kashmir, 1/3 of Kashmir, called Azad Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan. But the area that we're talking about is Indian-controlled or Indian-occupied, according to Kashmiris, Kashmir.
And so when did this partition happen, so people understand that part?
Yeah, so the partition happened in 1947. And just to give a bit of historical context, as you mentioned, everyone thinks about Kashmir as this dispute between India and Pakistan. When news media or politicians talk about it, it's usually called a conflict, a nuclear hotspot,
right,
a territorial dispute. And it also almost makes it seem as if there's no people there, no people with their own aspirations, lives, or desires. So from a very Kashmiri-centric perspective of the situation, their understanding of their struggle for self-determination actually goes back even beyond partition, even before partition, when Kashmiris were seeking sovereignty and political self-determination under their colonial rulers, the Dogras. And what happened at the time of partition is that India, the Indian subcontinent, which was ruled by the British, was divided into Muslim-majority Pakistan and Hindu-majority India. And Kashmir was this unique space that was a Muslim majority or had a Muslim majority, but the ruler of Kashmir at the time, who didn't have legitimacy amongst the local population, was a Hindu ruler. And, there's certain events that happened that I don't necessarily have to go into, but he ended up acceding to India during a treaty of accession in 1947, and that's when Indian troops came into Kashmir. So for Kashmiris, that's where their movement for self-determination essentially begins. India and Pakistan went to war over the region. India took the issue to the United Nations, and the United Nations basically called for an end to the hostilities, but also a plebiscite that would allow the Kashmiri people to decide where they wanted to go or to decide their future. And this is fundamentally what's at the root of the conflict today, is that this plebiscite has not occurred.
So it has never occurred. That vote that the UN said that should have been the prescription to resolve this then never happened.
Yes, exactly. It's never happened.
So when you talk about, just so we can all understand here conceptually, so the disputed part is the one that, this dispute, not the disputed part, but this dispute is over the part of Kashmir that is occupied by the Indian government, and they have military there. Of the people there living under occupation by the Indian rulers, what can you tell us about the demographics of them? I know it's Muslim majority. Is it overwhelmingly Muslim?
Yeah, so the Kashmir Valley is over 95% Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
There were different populations of Hindus and Sikhs there as well. Other parts of the state of Jammu and Kashmir, Jammu and Ladakh, have significant Hindu and Buddhist populations. So it is sort of a religiously and culturally diverse state, but it does have a Muslim majority.
So you said that vote never happened on deciding their own self-determination, or at least giving a sense of what their self-determination would be. Mm-hmm. Has there at least been polling or anything of the people who live there under Indian occupation about what they want?
There has been some polls that were conducted by independent think tanks and news media. Unfortunately, Kashmiris have never really been able to politically express themselves because they do live in a very undemocratic setup. But according to these polls, a vast majority of the people want freedom, and they do not want to be under Indian rule. And most would actually prefer to remain independent from both India and Pakistan. There is still a significant portion of the Kashmiris who would potentially want to be a part of Pakistan. But again, we won't really know until there is some kind of mechanism for determining what the people there themselves want.
And in the past, there's been some wars between India and Pakistan over Kashmir. I'm not sure how extensive the wars were, but I saw in the 1960s and in 1999. What were those wars about? Control of that land, or were they about other issues?
Yes, those were over. I mean, the original war was in 1947, right, when when India and Pakistan went to war and the region was split, partitioned in many ways, and then in 1965, and then in 1999 was the Kargil War. And they were, again, both countries kind of trying to control the narrative on Kashmir. But what's happened since the late 1980s has been there's been an indigenous uprising, which, for most of its history, most of Kashmir's modern history, people resisted peacefully. They tried to resist through constitutional means to try to get India to hold a plebiscite. When it seemed that the electoral process or constitutional means was not working out, in the late 1980s, some Kashmiris took on to the armed struggle. And this is when the region was heavily militarized. So Kashmir remains the most militarized region in the world. There's over 700,000 troops there. And in that time period, in the 90s and the early 2000s, Indian troops committed really horrific human rights abuses, including extrajudicial killings, torture, mass rapes. So this is kind of the generation today that's protesting against Indian rule that's kind of what they've grown up and lived under, is intense militarization.
So when you say there was intense militarization, it was all from the side of the Indian government? Were there Pakistani troops there as well?
No, it was all from the side of the Indian government. Pakistan did provide material and financial support to the rebels, but there were no official Pakistani troops in the Indian-controlled portion.
And what I didn't know, and I found doing research for this segment to chat with you, was that actually in the Constitution of the country of India, there was a provision, Article 370, that actually dealt with India's control of Kashmir. And tell us a little bit about that article, at least on paper, then we can talk about real life, what was really going on the ground there.
Yeah, sure. So in 1940, in the late 1940s, when the Maharaja ceded to India, the Indian government basically set into place a local client regime made up of Kashmiri leaders. And those leaders agreed that they would support the accession to India as long as Kashmir had its own autonomy. And by that, they meant that India would only take control over the region's defense, communications, and foreign affairs, and that the Kashmir state itself would be treated completely different from all the other Indian states. It would have its own constitution, its own flag, its own prime minister, and that any rules that were applied in India would have to go through the actual Jammu and Kashmir state legislature. And this has been eroded over time. So India's very effectively taken away Kashmir's autonomy, which was enshrined in this thing called Article 370. So for many Kashmiris, it was really symbolic in nature. But what's really important about what happened over a month ago is that India revoked Article 370 completely.
Right.
And another article, in addition to that, called Article 35A, which granted the Kashmiri state to define who could be citizens or subjects of the state. And now what Kashmiris are most threatened by is that citizens or subjects of the state were those who could buy land, own property, and now the region is opened up to people from India coming in, buying land, buying property, starting up businesses, and the fear is that they will drive out the locals from their homes. And that process can't happen non-violently. It usually entails some form of ethnic cleansing. And that's really what's at stake here, is that even though Kashmir's autonomy has been eroded over time, now Kashmiris see this latest move by India as an existential threat to their life, land, and property.
And I want to go through that because August 5th is when this happened. I'm chatting with Hafsa Kanjwal, assistant professor in South Asian history at Lafayette College. So August 5th, India gets rid of this article of their constitution, floods even more troops, is my understanding. Tell us what else happened on August 5th so we have an understanding of what it was like the day before, and then on August 5th, what happened then.
Yeah, so, ever since Modi has come back to power, people have been very fearful about what his second term in
just so
office
people
is
know,
going.
Modi's the Prime Minister of India, who's very ultra-nationalist, I should put it this way. Trump loves him. I mean, you get a sense of what's going on. In any event.
Yes.
Go
he's a Hindu nationalist. He's part of the BJP. He actually was not allowed to come to the U.S. He wasn't granted a visa because of his role in the Gujarat pogrom against India's Muslims. But basically, he comes to power as Indian Prime Minister, and this is his way to rally support for his second term in office. And a few days before August 5th, what the Indian government does is announces that all pilgrims and tourists should leave Kashmir immediately. It sends in these additional deployments of the troops, and people start to panic on the ground because they're sure that something is about to happen, but they don't know what exactly. And then slowly and surely, the Indian government completely cuts off Kashmir for the rest of the world. So it clamps down on all communications, including internet, mobile services, and even landlines for the first time, landlines, because the internet and mobile services are often cut off in Kashmir, but this is the first time that even landlines were blocked. Mm-hmm. And then it arrests thousands of political leaders, social activists, journalists, civic leaders, basically anyone that it fears is going to mobilize against this revocation. And what's really interesting is that it even arrests the Kashmiri political leadership that is pro-India or their own kind of stooges or collaborators. Because even though these guys work with India, they still want Kashmir to be autonomous, so they still support Article 370. So it even arrests all of them. So for weeks, even up until today, most people haven't been able to talk to their families because of the communication lockdown. And we've heard really horrifying reports in the kind of the media that's trickling out of the region about people getting detained, people being tortured, young boys as old as 11 years old getting picked up in the middle of the night from their homes and haven't returned to their homes. So it's a really, really horrific things that are happening on the ground. Things like medicine and essential supplies are not, we don't know if people have access to proper health care. There's kind of indefinite curfew in particular parts of Kashmir as well, where people can't travel easily or go to the hospital. Of course, things like schools and businesses and banks and everything is shut down. So, right. I mean, everything in Kashmir was not really normal before August 5th because people still lived under a military occupation. But now, I mean, it's almost as if the whole place has been completely silenced.
And we won't know the full details of what's happened to these people until this embargo of information is lifted by the Indian government, essentially?
Yeah, we won't know the full details. And India works very, very hard to make sure that people don't know the full details. They make it very hard for journalists to go in and cover the story. We're hearing reports about, journalists getting beaten up or having their files taken away from them or cameras smashed. They also have a really intense propaganda machine in the outside world where anytime the BBC or the New York Times or Washington Post covered the story, India basically declared that all of those articles were fake news. So
where did they learn that? I wonder where they learned that from.
Yes, exactly. You can see how one kind of authoritarian ruler is able to embolden another one. But yeah, India is really trying to gain control of the information. But what's happened is that the Kashmiri diaspora and other people who are obviously very concerned about these developments around the world have really taken it upon themselves to speak out against what's happening and really become the voice for the literal voiceless, right? I mean, there's no other way right now to get information from Kashmir.
Well, what's India's end game here? Is it truly ethnic cleansing and taking the land, or just complete control of it? And if people stay, they stay. Or if they leave, they don't care. I mean, what is the true end game of the Indian government right now under Modi doing this?
I mean, under Modi's government is a right-wing Hindu fascist state, and for them, not just in Kashmir but throughout India, their goal. I mean, the way that they see the Indian subcontinent is that it's a Hindu state. They have this idea of a Hindu Rashtra, and Muslims and other ethnic and religious minorities, including Christians, don't belong to this vision, right? So they have started with Kashmir, and of course, the end game for many people is an ethnic cleansing. The way that Islamophobia works is really traumatizing. I mean, just to think about the ways in which right now Hindu nationalists are talking about Kashmiri women in particular, basically telling people that, okay, as soon as the siege is over, we're going to go in and marry fair-skinned Kashmiri women and buy land. So, I mean, this is the kind of popular discourses that are happening in India that have been promoted by their government. And they haven't just done this to Kashmir. Just recently, they also rendered about 1.9 million citizens, mostly Muslim, of the state of Assam, stateless. They took away their citizenship rights.
Based
so
on,
a lot
for
of
what reason?
Religious and
How could they?
Sorry?
How did they do that? I mean, it's obviously a different constitution in the U.S., but how did they do that?
They created a national registry of citizens of that state, and 1.9 million people were not included in it, basically.
Was because of their faith?
It's an ethnic origin because there's a lot of Bengali-speaking people in Assam who have been there for many, many years. Of course, Assam borders Bangladesh, and all of these states have had a lot of movement back and forth over the past few decades. But basically, the Bengali-speaking people who live in Assam have been declared not citizens, so just completely taken off the citizenship record.
So, what has the response of the Trump administration been to this?
I mean, quite muted. I don't even think the Trump administration knows where Kashmir is on the map, to be honest with you. A lot of people feel that just some weeks ago when Trump met the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, he kind of just blurted out that Modi had asked him to mediate on Kashmir, which is certainly not the case. I mean, the Indians will never, ever, ever want any international party. For them, they see Kashmir as a law and order problem, as a terrorist or a radicalization problem. They would never seek international mediation on the issue. So I think what a lot of people were saying is that Modi was kind of forced to take the step in this time because of Trump's comments. And since then, there hasn't really been much from the U.S. or the White House or even the State Department, really. There's been a number of Congress people and, even Bernie Sanders, for example, at the ISNA convention, who've brought up the human rights abuses and their concerns over what's been happening in India. But a lot more needs to happen. I mean, India is a huge country, a huge global economic and political powerhouse. They have a lot of influence, especially in the United States. So there really needs to be a more concerted effort to ensure that this does not continue.
Are you optimistic at all that this will not continue? I mean, the UN is going back. I live on the east side of Manhattan, close to the UN. So it'll open, I think next week or the week after it opens, and all the leaders will be there. Should the UN get involved, and is that effective at all?
So the UN actually had its first, the Security Council had their first meeting on Kashmir after 50 years a couple of weeks ago, upon the behest of the Chinese and the Pakistani delegations. And it was a closed-door session. They came out with a very kind of muted response. I know, most of these countries are observing the situation very closely, but it remains to be seen what will happen. When Modi does come in, though, in late September for the UN General Assembly in New York, he's also giving a huge talk in front of about 50,000 people in Houston. And there is work at the moment to mobilize against this, to make sure that there's huge protests both in New York and in Houston and other cities around the country against him, against his speeches.
It's heartbreaking to hear about this. I mean, I have friends who are from the area who reached out to me. I came up at ISNA speaking to people. Many people brought this up. And it gets almost no media coverage in America. And partly that's by design because of the Indian government and the military there is to clamp down on telecommunications and any communications, internet, phone. And as you pointed out, as others told me, and as you're verifying here, that, India has a very effective propaganda or PR campaign and what they do, and they don't want the story of what's going on. So we don't really know the full extent. I don't want to speculate, but I saw some reports too in different publications, Al Jazeera English and other places, about the torture of certain people. But we really won't fully be able to appreciate what happens until that's lifted, if it's lifted, and the communications blackouts allowed, and the Americans and the world can see what's happened there.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it sounds heartbreaking. I mean, I have, and by the way, what has Pakistan's response been to this?
Pakistan is kind of pulled, and I think they were shocked and surprised that this happened. This is something that people have been talking about for some time, but nobody really thought that the Indian government would do this, just because it's so dramatic. It just makes the region so much more unstable as a result. But Pakistan is really just trying to go the diplomatic route. Right. I've been fairly impressed with how Imran Khan has responded to the situation. I would encourage all of your listeners to read his op-ed in the New York Times, where he basically centers Kashmiris and what they're going through, and says that Kashmiris have a right to self-determination, and that this isn't just about, India and Pakistan can't afford to go to another war. Right. Both of their countries are suffering from so many different hardships, right? And their average citizens are suffering, and they cannot afford to go to another war. So Pakistan has been trying to really push the diplomatic angle to come to a resolution on Kashmir. But, a lot of Western countries have their own impressions of Pakistan and still suspect Pakistan for a number of reasons. So it remains unclear what effect that will have. But for the most part, what's coming out from the Pakistani leadership is so much more reasonable than what's coming out from the Indian side.
The Pakistani Prime Minister, it was reported today, he may have said it yesterday, said, "I've informed the world that Pakistan does not want war, but at the same time, Pakistan cannot remain oblivious to the challenge posed to its security and integrity." So you've got, it's not crazy saber rattling. You have much more measured terms like you're getting at here, but they are nuclear powers. I don't think they're going to use nuclear weapons against each other. They're on top of each other. I don't think that's going to happen. Even if they, and I'm not even suggesting they want to do that, but if they were, as a practical matter, I don't know how you even do that. But the people of Kashmir who are living under occupation here are suffering in silence because we don't know what's going on. And, partition and occupation are things I have some familiarity with, considering my family's Palestinian, that I know about a war in 1947 that involved, Palestinians in my family, and occupation now that my family lives under. Although there is more media coverage because things have changed. Unless you live in Gaza, then no one really knows what's going on in Gaza. But they live in the West Bank, my family. So I thank you, Professor, for spending some time with us. It's a topic that gets almost no national media coverage, like minutes here or there. And the coverage, a lot are concerned that it's being whitewashed about what's really going on by India and their military. And we just don't fully know what they're doing. But what I've seen so far is scary and startling. And, Bernie Sanders, in the third hour tonight, we're going to play some of the ISNA, because I was there, some more of the speeches, and Julian Castro and Bernie. We're going to play both of them talking about what was going on. And what Bernie talked about specifically was inability for people to get to hospitals. And I saw that reported as well, and medical care, because of whatever closure and freedom of travel just ending, apparently. And again, it's all reporting through people. It's not, they're trying to get out here to tell us their story, and they can't even tell us their story. So I appreciate your time, Professor, and your lesson on history, and both in what's going on today and what happened in the past and how we got here.
Thank you. Thanks so much.